The scripture passage this morning is from Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians in chapter 1, verses 10 through 17. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement and there be no divisions among you, that you be united in the same mind and with the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one can say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I don't know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to proclaim the gospel, and not with eloquent wisdom, so that the cross of Christ might not be emptied of its power. The word of the Lord. The church is sometimes broken. Actually, that should have been the church is often broken, I think. Let me tell you a little bit about this church in Corinth. This was one of the first churches founded. Paul, on one of his missionary journeys, ended up in the city of Corinth. Now, Corinth is a very important port, and it's a port on one side of a little narrow isthmus that allows goods to come by sea on one side and cross the land a very short space and go off by sea on the other side. So it was a rich port town. It was a mixed city with people from all over the Mediterranean, different religious groups, different ethnic groups. And I say it was a rich city. In the ancient world, that just meant there were more rich people than usual, but of course most everybody was part of the working poor, and some people were part of the poor. And Paul showed up here when no one had yet heard the message of Christ, and he preached to them and started a small church. And then after a year or so, he moved on and went elsewhere to preach. He went back to Asia Minor, what's now Turkey. And while he was away, a fellow named Apollos came up from, well, Apollos was originally from somewhere in Egypt, probably Alexandria, but I don't know where Apollos was right before he went to Corinth. But Apollos came, and he was a very educated, skilled preacher, one who had studied not just the Bible, but had also studied philosophy and rhetoric, that is how to give speeches and stuff. And he was great. They loved him. He was a smoother, more exciting, more emotional, more intellectual preacher than Paul was. And Apollos moved on after a while. A lot of the leaders of the early church moved from place to place because they were getting churches started. Some people came up from Jerusalem and said, hey, look, we're from the original apostles. We've been sent here by Peter, Cephas. Cephas was Peter's name in Aramaic. And they, said, here's a connection with the original church in Jerusalem, right from Jesus' mouth. And then there were people who said, hey, it's all whatever, I'm with Christ, whatchamacallit. And people divided up into groups. You'd think everybody would say, hey, we got a little bit from Paul, and then this from Apollos, and the people from Jerusalem came. It all fits together, and this is great. But it didn't happen like that in Corinth. There were a lot of divisions in church between rich and poor, between people who had previously been Jews and previously been Gentiles, between people who were Greek-speaking and Latin-speaking. And I don't know what other divisions there were, but there were enough ethnic groups in Corinth that there could have been others. There were arguments about how to have the Lord's Supper. They used to come together to have the Lord's Supper, and everybody would bring a whole meal. And what we do with the bread and wine was just a piece of the whole meal. But people would bring their own stuff. So the people who were well off would bring a sumptuous meal. The poor would be lucky if they could bring a loaf of bread and some cheese and some cheap, crummy wine. The middle-class people would bring medium good food that they had, and they didn't share. There's a chapter later in this where Paul talks about that, and he says, what are you doing? What are you doing? How come everybody's not sharing with everybody? There were different beliefs about sexual practices and sexual ethics because of people from different backgrounds. The people from a Jewish background came from a very strict sexual ethic. The people from a Roman background came from a very loose, everything's all right background. And even though they now thought, okay, that's not quite right anymore, they nonetheless were practicing it much more loosely. And Paul fusses at them about that later. As a matter of fact, these whole two letters for the church to Corinth, this first one and the second one, are full of discussions of the way that church was broken, divided, screwed up, and yet they held it together. They became one of the most important churches in Christendom at that time because they were also a port city. People went out from there as well as coming to there. So it became a center of infection for Christian faith. But they were famous, at least for the first century or so, for being full of disagreements as well. And yet this was an important church. The church is sometimes broken, and that doesn't stop it in the least from being the church. And that doesn't stop God in the least from working God's will through the church. Relationships between those leaders that people separated themselves according to were actually better than they were among the different groups of people. Apollos got to know Paul. Paul later was teaching in Ephesus, and Apollos came to Ephesus, and he and Paul talked together about the church in Corinth, among other things. And Apollos was so concerned that the people in Corinth thought that he was a better preacher than Paul, that Apollos refused to go back to Corinth until after Paul had worked with the church back there and had overcome that party spirit. Apollos didn't want to go back and teach them and give them a chance to say, hey, I'm with Apollos, not with Paul. Paul was not an eloquent speaker, at least he doesn't think so himself, and people reacted to him such that I don't think he is. He just pounded on the facts that he knew that made a difference. And that may have been the best thing to do right at first. You've got to grab people's hearts. But then once people have become Christians, they want something a little richer, a little more well thought through, a little easier to understand, maybe connected to thoughts about what the rest of the world is like. So once they become Christians, they loved Apollos. But Apollos himself knew better and didn't want to give them the chance to figure they could somehow separate themselves from Paul. And so Paul is addressing these divisions, and he's saying, hey look, this is a mistake. You've got it mixed up. None of these leaders did for you what Jesus Christ does for you. None of these leaders can do anything for you that they aren't given by Jesus Christ to give to you. So cut it out. Stop dividing yourself into little cliques. Stop arguing with one another about what's good and what's right. Okay. I could tell you, I could probably tell you 100 whole stories about other churches since that have suffered divisions like this and arguments like this. We're one of them. As a matter of fact, we're one of them right now. We are practically doing the same thing, orienting our divisions up according to who our leaders are, and according to who does what and does it better and does what I like and think is right rather and better than the other person. We're in danger of this right now. And we're in danger of letting it mess ourselves up. You know, I presume that some of you know, that 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a meeting so that people who supported what Pastor Jimmy has been doing with us could say so and explain why it was so good. And I think there's some really good things Pastor Jimmy's done for us. I think he's had a good strategic vision for what we have to do. He got us moved over here. His presence in Presbyterian is what made us known to the people here at Hillsborough so that they were willing to give us their building. He saw from the beginning, I know because I talked to him during his first year here before I was invited, that we needed to build up our Mandarin ministry. He's had good strategic vision for what needs to be done. On the other hand, he's suffered the normal reaction to that because he's been pushing. And when you push on people, they push back. I've seen that kind of thing happen in churches before. There was a church right next to mine down in the other part of New Jersey, a church called Kirkpatrick. And churches in that corner of New Jersey were slowly dying because the young families weren't staying. And this one church, John Groth was the pastor, and John decided we have got to start a second service, a praise-style service for younger families. We've got to bring in paid babysitters during that service because the young families have children, and you've all been working it so that they have to volunteer and take turns taking care of the children during the worship, and that means that they don't get to worship, and thus it's chasing the young families away. And he pushed for 2 years before he was able to get session to agree to do it, and then he had to push for another 2 years to make it work. And it did work. It worked wonderfully. The young families came. The young families that were at my church went there. And I blessed them when they went. First of all, because there's only one church, so they weren't leaving me in my church. And second of all, I've been trying to convince our session to do something like that for 4 years and not succeeding. And I thought these young families who went up there were doing the exact right thing for their families. That service was the making of that church. In a circle of 6 small Presbyterian churches, that's the one that grew to almost 200, while the others shrank from 100 to around 60. But John Groth, the pastor who made it happen, had to push so hard to make it happen that people resented it, they pushed back, they felt that he wasn't listening to them, because in part he was listening to them a little bit and then pushing them again, so that at the end of the time, when he'd done the right thing, he couldn't stay anymore. He'd used up all the influence and all the respect he had in the congregation, pushing them along. And he had to go. The next pastor to come there was a friend of mine named Ryan Balson. And Ryan reaped the benefit of what John Groth had done. And the service at the beginning, the praise service, was a great thing. And Ryan knew that he didn't do it. He didn't make it happen. He knew that he was reaping the benefits of what John Groth had done. Mind you, John had faults too. He knew exactly what he wanted to preach about and why, and he preached about that whether people liked it or not. Everybody's got faults. I got some myself. I remember the first time I went on mission trip down to North Carolina, like we just went today. Christine pulled me aside about 3 days in and said, "Hey, you're acting too much like a teacher. You're telling all the young people facts about this, facts about that, challenging the way they think. They're here to help build houses, not to take another class during the summertime." I really appreciated that. That's the kind of thing that I exactly have to have from people if I'm going to shift gears and adjust. I got to hear and understand criticisms, especially criticisms that are correct. I said a few other stupid things in the presence of some other people, and one of them pulled me aside and said, "Hey, you hurt my feelings." I didn't like that. It didn't help me. Sometimes when someone says that, you think it through and you think, yeah, but I said the right thing. Your feelings need to be hurt because you need to be pushed. But in this case, I thought, and I said, whoops, she's utterly right and I was wrong. She's utterly right and I was wrong. The fact that she was willing to do that made her one of my favorite people in the whole church. I loved that. Pardon me, I say I loved it, but also it hurt and it was uncomfortable and I didn't like it. I loved it, but I didn't like it. So here we are. We've been pushed. We changed buildings. We moved over. It was a big jerk when we did it. And we'd hoped to get a smoother move. And we weren't able to because the church in New Brunswick jumped on our backs. I'm sorry about that, it happens. And then we got here and we couldn't make this building work the way we wanted it to right away. And we had to consider where are we going and what are we going to do. And now we've got divisions between people who say, hey, we need to build more space because if we don't get things ready, people won't come. And other people who say, hey, we can't do anything yet until more people come and we got more money to make it happen. We got a division there, and the two sides, well, if they were Americans, they'd be butting heads hard. We're Taiwanese, so we butt heads quietly in the background. Right? Is that what we're like?
Yes.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
You know? And we had to establish a Mandarin service. We didn't have to, I guess, but it was the right thing to do. And it's working better and better all the time. But there were divisions over that. There were older people who said, wait a minute, we started a Taiwanese-speaking church precisely to preserve the Taiwanese language. So why are we starting Mandarin worship? That's exactly the thing that we were trying to get away from. On the other hand, people looked and said, hey, these young people who need Mandarin worship aren't the people who made the problem back in Taiwan. They're the grandchildren of the people who made the problem. They don't even know, at least not in their hearts, even if they know in their heads from history lessons, they don't even know why there's a division over language. And so, of course, we did decide to support that, build that up. We've built it up now. They're meeting here once a month before worship in our space, and we have to help them learn how to run our, what do we call it, our mixer. But we will, and that'll work. But there was a lot of division in the congregation over that, a little fussing and squeezing back and forth. And people blamed the pastor for a fight that was actually being held between two groups of people in the church. And I, sitting here, was getting some undeserved praise because Jimmy had to do the pushing, and I got to sit here and just do nice preaching, helping us understand who we were and what we should be like and where we should go. I got a benefit there because it wasn't my job to push people where they didn't want to be pushed. It was his. And then too, I'm a little older, so when I do push people, I push people a little more gently, and that comes across. And we have different skill sets. And the last thing in the world I wanted to see happen was any division where people line up with this pastor or that pastor thinking that's where the division lies. My goodness, Jimmy and I have been on pretty much the same page with one another the whole time. We've talked over what I'm going to do, how it fits, what he's going to do, from before the time I started here. The church is sometimes broken. Our church is partly broken, right here, right now. The church throughout history has sometimes been broken. It's almost always been broken in some place or another over some issue or another. And each and every church has sometimes been broken, even if each and every church has also had times when everything just seems to fit together and work just right. We're being pushed again right now. We are stretching our resources to the uttermost limit to bring in a pastor for our Mandarin-speaking congregation, because Jimmy can't do all of what has to be done for both the Taiwanese-speaking and the Mandarin-speaking, at least not all by himself. And I can't do hardly any of it. I don't speak either of those languages. I can be nice to people and respectful to people, and some of the Taiwanese-speaking people and some of the Mandarin-speaking people come down here and listen to me sometimes, and that's nice, and I appreciate it. But we've now got two pastors, actually we've got 2.5 pastors doing a job that only needs about 1 3/4 or 2 pastors. And instead of saying to ourselves, okay, that's a good thing for now, even though we're going to have to squeeze it back somehow, it's way easy to fall into the pattern of, well, wait a minute, I think we need this pastor the most, and that pastor the least, and this pastor only maybe. And yet different people will have a different one of those pastors that they'll think is the one we need the most, and why. Christians shouldn't be acting like this. Even when we disagree with someone, we should be saying to ourselves, hey, they might be right. Or even if they're wrong, God might still be using them to do a good thing. And if I disagree with them, I should be helping them to be better, not trying to push them away or get away from them. And if there's someone we think well of, we should be saying to ourselves, but wait a minute, he's not Christ. He didn't die for me. Even if he does something well, that's a gift from God. Not totally him or her. And I have to reserve some of the respect I might give them to make sure that I'm giving respect first and foremost to Jesus Christ. When churches go through hard times figuring out what they need in a pastor, sometimes they generate a lot of resentments. You see this in marriages too. When a marriage is about to break up, instead of everybody saying, hey, this just doesn't fit anymore, they say, they must be bad. There must be something wrong. Someone must have misbehaved. And they get angry at one another because breaking the bond hurts so much that they use anger to block the pain. I'm sure that some of you have seen that happen in marriages of friends that have broken up. It can happen to a church too. Even when things need to change, we still ought to be able to do that with love, affection, respect, helping one another, with reconciliation, not division. It's harder work to do it that way. But if we Christians aren't capable of doing that harder work, then what did we think we're doing calling ourselves Christians? What do we think we're doing? Trying to be disciples. If we're not even doing the very thing that's hard to do, but that we of all people should be able to do, because we count on God to guide us, on God to teach us, and on God to fill our hearts and enable us to do what's hard to do. Even when things fall apart. If we're the church, they should fall apart with love, mutual respect, helping one another, building one another up, making one another better. And then, sometimes, going different ways or doing different things because that is the wisest thing to do, but not because we've let ourselves get angry at one another. Did Paul get crucified for you? Was Apollos crucified for you? Is Peter in the place of Christ? No. We all belong to Jesus Christ. All these other leaders and all these other divisions and all these other ethnic groups and whatever divisions we have, they might be differences among us. And those differences might be supposed to exist and even be part of the goodness of our diversity. But those divisions should not separate us from Christ and from one another. They should just be the differences in who we are as we are one together.